I was released from prison at 67. I had no home, no job, no past anyone would want to remember. The only thing I had left was a wooden whale I carved by hand in my cell. I kept it in my pocket when I saw my grandchildren for the first time. They didn't know who I was. My daughter told them, "He's a sailor. He traveled a lot." And I just watched them laugh, realizing I was a stranger to them. But maybe the whale would remain. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Raymond Holloway. I was 67 years old when the state of Ohio gave me back my freedom. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the sky was the color of wet concrete. I stood outside the front gate of the correctional facility with a canvas bag over one shoulder, wearing clothes I hadn't seen in over a decade. Stiff jeans, a flannel shirt faded from years of folding and refolding, and a coat that still held the faint scent of institutional soap. The rain was light, steady, and indifferent. It wasn't the kind that soaked you, just the kind that clung to everything, working into your skin until it felt like it had always been there. I didn't bother with the hood. I wanted to feel it. Real rain, not the kind that spat through broken windows in the block, not the kind you saw from behind steel bars. This was sky rain, open-air rain, honest rain. No one was waiting for me at the gate. I hadn't expected anyone. My daughter hadn't written in years, and the few friends I had on the outside had long since vanished or joined me on the inside. A correctional officer handed me my personal effects: a faded wallet with no cash, a photograph yellowed at the edges, and a wooden figurine I had carved during my last year behind bars, a small whale, smooth from being turned over in my hands 1,000 times. It barely fit in my palm. I slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't linger. The guards didn't say goodbye, and I didn't look back. There was a bus stop a half-mile down the road, past a row of rusted fences and utility poles. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because the world felt too large all of a sudden, like someone had turned up the brightness on everything. The air smelled like damp leaves and truck exhaust. A crow picked at something in the gravel beside the road and didn't bother to move when I passed. When I reached the stop, there was an old wooden bench under a cracked plexiglass shelter. I sat, feeling the dampness seep through the fabric of my jeans. My knees ached the way they always did when the weather turned cold. I stretched one leg out and tapped my heel twice, an old habit I'd picked up in the yard. A way to remind myself I was still there. The bus came 20 minutes later. The driver barely glanced at me. I paid with the voucher they gave me and sat near the back, next to a window streaked with water. The seats were stiff and cracked. I held the bag on my lap, one hand resting on the zipper. My fingers kept brushing the outline of the wooden whale inside my pocket. Columbus was 2 hours away. I spent the ride watching the fields and strip malls roll past. So much had changed. Billboards for things I didn't recognize, cars that looked like toys, people glued to glowing screens. It felt like I'd been gone longer than I had, or maybe the world had just moved on without me. I tried to think about what I would say when I saw her, my daughter, Anna, but the words didn't come. I hadn't spoken to her in 30 years, not since the last letter, not since she told me not to write again. I'd honored that. Mostly. A few postcards, unsigned, had made their way to her mailbox over the years. I didn't expect her to keep them. The bus pulled into the city around midday. The sky was still heavy with clouds, and the sidewalks glistened. I got off downtown, near a coffee shop and a row of storefronts that looked like they belonged in a different time. I stood for a while on the corner, just breathing. The city air tasted like wet metal and burnt toast. I had an address. It was written on a piece of notebook paper, folded into fourths and stored in my wallet. I had copied it down from an old DMV record one of the re-entry counselors helped me pull up a few months before release. I didn't know if she still lived there, but it was the only thing I had, the only direction that pointed anywhere familiar. I walked to a diner 2 blocks from the bus terminal and bought a cup of black coffee with the little money left on my card. The woman behind the counter didn't ask questions. She poured the coffee into a paper cup and slid it toward me without a word. I thanked her, then sat at a corner table near the window. The heat from the cup worked its way into my hands. I stared out at the street, the slow rhythm of tires sloshing through puddles. A man walked past, pushing a stroller, humming something to the baby inside. I watched him until he disappeared. The wooden whale was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, turned it over in my palm. The grain of the wood had darkened from the oil in my skin. I had carved it from a scrap of maple stolen from the workshop. It took me weeks, sanding, shaping, smoothing until every edge felt like memory. I didn't know why I chose a whale. Maybe because it was something ancient, something that moved through darkness without making a sound. I hadn't made it for me. I had made it for the grandchildren I had never met. They didn't know I existed. Or if they did, I was a story told in half sentences. A man who had been away. A name on a birth certificate. A missing photo in a family album. I didn't want to scare them. I didn't want to confuse them. I just wanted to see their faces once. Not to explain. Just to be near them for a moment. To leave behind something small and harmless. Something they could hold without knowing where it came from. The coffee cooled. I drank it anyway. When I stood to leave, I left a $1 bill and a quarter on the table. My hands trembled slightly as I zipped up my coat. I didn't look back at the waitress. I didn't want to see the way she might have looked at me, like a man too old, too lost to matter. Outside, the rain had started again, finer now, almost mist. It gathered in the creases of my coat and on the back of my neck. I walked toward the address, one step at a time, the wooden whale pressed tight in my pocket, like a compass made from guilt and hope. And all the while, I heard the ticking of my old wristwatch beneath the cuff. Steady, reluctant, still trying to measure something that couldn't be counted. The piece of paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become permanent. I kept it in the back sleeve of my wallet, behind the expired license and the meal ticket I never redeemed on my last day inside. The edges were frayed, and one corner had torn off at some point, leaving a jagged triangle of absence in the upper left. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was still clear. My own, blocky and deliberate. I had written the address the day I found it with the help of a prison volunteer named Carol, who used the public access records database at the library computer once a week for men like me. It wasn't guaranteed to be current. It wasn't even guaranteed to be hers. But it was something. As I stood on the corner, 2 blocks away from where it led, I could feel the paper burning in my pocket. I hadn't looked at it since the bus ride in, but I didn't need to. I had memorized it, line by line, number by number. Even the zip code was etched into my head like a scar. It was early afternoon. The rain had become a fine mist, soft enough that it settled on my coat without soaking it. The streets were damp but not puddled. Leaves stuck to the sidewalks, pressed flat like forgotten letters. There was a quiet to the neighborhood, the kind that came from routine. People at work, children still at school, lives happening just out of sight. The houses here were modest. 2 stories, white siding, small porches with worn railings and flower pots still holding the last color of fall. A flag here and there. Wind chimes that barely moved. Mailboxes leaning at tired angles. It was the kind of place where people mowed their own lawns and knew their neighbors' dogs by name. I walked slowly. Every step felt like peeling back another layer of years. I imagined her there, somewhere behind one of those front doors, maybe wiping a countertop, maybe folding a blanket over a couch, maybe pouring juice into cups with cartoon characters on them. I didn't know what she looked like anymore. Not really. The last photo I had of her was from a birthday card she'd sent when she was 13, long before she stopped writing. Long before I gave her a reason to. The address was number 2124, a pale green house with blue shutters. There was a tricycle near the steps and 2 carved pumpkins by the porch, one beginning to cave in on itself, the other still grinning with jagged teeth. A pair of rain boots sat neatly beside the front door, small enough to belong to a child no older than 6. I stopped at the edge of the driveway. The air smelled of wet leaves and warm wood. Somewhere nearby, someone was burning a fire in a backyard pit. The scent curled into my chest and settled deep, like something remembered too late. My hand went to my pocket. Not for the paper, for the whale. The little wooden figure rested there like it had always belonged, smooth and quiet, the shape of it worn down by months of polishing, by nervous fingers, by time. I pressed it lightly, grounding myself. I told myself I wasn't here to demand anything. I wasn't here to fix what couldn't be fixed. I was just here to knock. The porch steps creaked beneath my weight. The wood was damp and darkened, but solid. I stood in front of the door for longer than I should have. There was a wreath hanging from a metal hook, simple, made of burlap and pine cones. A small sign in the corner read, "Welcome," though it felt more like a formality than an invitation. I looked at the doorbell, then at the doorknob, then at my own reflection in the thin window beside it. I didn't recognize myself. Not really. The face staring back at me was lined, pale from the long winter of prison light. My beard was trimmed, but the gray had overtaken everything. My eyes were smaller than I remembered, more cautious, more distant. I looked like a man who had spent too long indoors, too long talking to his own thoughts, too long learning to disappear. And still, I raised my hand and knocked. Not loud, just enough to be heard if someone was near. Then I waited. I listened for movement, for footsteps, for the shush of fabric, for the cautious pause of someone checking the peephole. But the only sound I heard was the soft tick of my watch, barely audible above the wind. Then the door opened, and there she was. Older. Of course she was older. She would have been 36 by now, but still her. Same eyes, same mouth, a little harder around the edges, a little more tired in the way her shoulders carried her. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. I opened my mouth, but no words came. She looked at me for a long time, then stepped outside and closed the door behind her. She folded her arms across her chest, not protectively, just firmly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the whale. I didn't hand it to her. I just held it out in my open palm. She stared at it, and her jaw tightened. Still, she didn't speak, but she nodded. Once. And in that nod, I understood everything I was allowed to understand. She wasn't inviting me in. She wasn't forgiving me. But she wasn't turning me away either. She said I could see the children. One time. Just one. And that was more than I had dared to hope for. When I turned to leave, I didn't look back. I walked down the driveway with the whale still in my hand. I tucked it gently into the inside pocket of my coat, careful not to crush it. The rain had picked up slightly, enough to blur the street signs, but I didn't need them anymore. I knew exactly where I was, for the first time in a long time. The clock on the wall ticked with a rhythm I hadn't heard in decades. It was the sound of a home, not mine, but someone else's. The kind of place where cereal is poured into plastic bowls before school, and where magnets on the fridge hold crooked drawings with smiling suns and green stick figures. The ticking reminded me I was no longer behind bars, but the air still felt thick with rules. I sat on the very edge of the floral print couch, my knees stiff, my palms damp and folded over each other. Across from me, my daughter stood by the kitchen counter, not touching her coffee, just watching the steam rise. Her name was Maggie. I hadn't said it out loud yet. My throat wouldn't let me. She had my late wife's nose, but her posture was all mine. Rigid, like someone bracing for impact. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of years. It carried the weight of birthday candles I hadn't blown out with her, of report cards I never saw, of emergency room visits, dances, weddings, every chapter of her life that unfolded without me. She didn't owe me this meeting, but still, she gave me 15 minutes and a single condition. No explanations, no apologies, no questions. The rain had stopped outside, but the droplets clung to the window like fingerprints. I stared through them, past the trimmed hedges and the parked car in the driveway, and tried to gather enough air to speak. But she had made herself clear. I was here for one thing: the children. I hadn't known their names. That was the cruel part. I had memorized the grain of the wooden bench I carved for each of them in the prison workshop, but I didn't know what their voices sounded like. I had imagined their laughter the way a man imagines the sea without having ever seen it. Broad strokes, impossible colors. She walked to the hallway and returned with a single photo. It was a school picture. 2 kids, probably 7 and 9, smiling, gap-toothed, with hair combed like it was still wet. They had her eyes, but the boy's ears curved like mine. The girl had a jaw too strong for her age. I stared at the photo until the colors blurred. My breath felt heavier than the room allowed. Maggie placed the picture face down on the table between us and sat. Her fingers brushed against the wedding band she now wore. Thin gold, not the thick silver one she wore in childhood when she used to steal her mother's rings for play. That memory surfaced without permission. She cleared her throat. Not loudly, not sharply, just enough to signal time was moving and I should keep up. "You can meet them," she said. The words were sanded down, smooth and cautious. "One time." I nodded. My chest didn't move. She continued, her voice even flatter now. "You can't tell them anything. Not where you were. Not why. You were away. That's all they know. That's all they need to know." Her words carved lines in the air. I felt them settle on my shoulders, cold and familiar, like shackles. But I accepted them. I didn't come here to claim anything. Not forgiveness, not a place at the table. I came for the shape of their faces, for the sound of their names. I asked for it quietly, my voice rusted and raw. She wrote the address on a small piece of torn grocery list paper. Her handwriting had changed. It was no longer loopy and uncertain, but printed and angular, like someone who filled out forms every day and signed things she didn't believe in. The address was in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. Suburban, probably. 2 floors, maybe a dog, maybe a yard where bikes were left leaning against fences. I had imagined meeting them in a park, but she was inviting me to their home. Her voice broke the air once more. "Don't bring gifts." I reached into my coat pocket anyway, slowly, carefully, like I was holding a bird. It was a carved wooden dolphin, no bigger than a child's palm. The wood had darkened over time, stained from the oils in my hands. Its body was smooth, but the eyes were burnt in with the end of a cigarette. A craftsman in cell block D taught me that trick. The dolphin was hollow underneath. Not a toy, not really. More a symbol. Of what? I wasn't sure. Hope, maybe. A thing that moved forward, even in dark water. I set it on the table, between us. She didn't touch it. The ticking clock filled the silence again. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Life went on. Maggie stood. I stood. She opened the door without another word. The wind outside was sharp. It smelled like wet leaves and cold metal. The grocery list paper flapped once in my hand before I folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of my coat, right next to the photo. I had 48 hours to find the right shirt, the right shoes, the right expression, but none of those things mattered. I was walking toward a house where I would be a visitor in my own bloodline. I would walk in, look down, and see their eyes looking up at me. Curious, kind, confused, and I would say the line I had practiced 1,000 times behind concrete walls. I was away for a while, and that would be all. I arrived too early. It wasn't the first time in my life that I'd waited for something I wasn't sure I deserved. But that morning, the air itself felt like a wall I wasn't allowed to lean against. The coffee shop sat on a corner where two quiet streets met like folded arms. Its brick facade had probably been cleaned up a dozen times since I last walked free, but the brick still held that dull brown that reminded me of county buildings and forgotten homes. I stood across the street for 20 minutes before crossing, not because I was hesitant, because I didn't want to bring prison-scented fear into the smell of morning bread. Inside, the place smelled of cinnamon and vanilla syrup and burnt espresso grounds that no one had swept from the corners, a clatter of cups, steam rising from the machine. Conversations overlapped in low hums, like the sound of bees trapped in amber. I sat at a table near the window, the one the barista pointed to without looking at me. Maybe she didn't notice me, or maybe I was just already halfway invisible. I kept my jacket on. It was the same one they gave me when I left the facility. Dark blue, synthetic, a bit too long in the sleeves. I folded the cuffs like I used to when I worked in the auto shop, back when grease stains were the mark of honest labor and not social decay. The chair creaked beneath me, and I leaned into the sound as if it could say something in my place. On the table, I placed the wooden horse. It was no bigger than my palm. I had carved it during my last year. Elmwood, smooth from weeks of sanding, tail curved downward as if the creature were bowing. I didn't add eyes. Something about the blankness felt more honest. I set it on a napkin and turned it slightly so that it faced the window. Let it look out. Let it see what I never did. Time didn't move in minutes, but in heartbeats. I checked the old wristwatch I had found in the bottom of the cardboard box the shelter gave me. Still ticking, though the leather strap had hardened and cracked like dry earth. The second hand dragged slightly. Like me, it moved, but not smoothly. The sky outside brightened as the sun peeled back the thin morning fog. Children passed by, holding their parents' hands, backpacks bouncing. One of them wore a Spider-Man beanie, the same kind I remembered seeing in catalogs they left behind in the waiting rooms. I wondered if my grandson had a favorite superhero, or if he even believed in heroes. The coffee grew cold in my cup. I hadn't touched it. The steam had vanished minutes ago, leaving behind a skin of oil on the surface that shimmered faintly under the overhead lights. I watched it shift. Then I looked away. Some things are better left unexamined up close. I had seen her picture once. My daughter. The warden had handed me the envelope without comment the year I turned 60. Inside, 2 photos. One of her in a graduation robe, eyes distant but proud. The other, her standing next to a man I never met, with 2 toddlers between them like punctuation marks in a sentence I couldn't read. That photo lived inside my pillow for years, creased and soft from the weight of my regret. I folded my hands together. My fingers ached in the joints, not from age, but from years of cold. They no longer bent all the way. I hid them under the table, embarrassed by the way they curled like broken roots. The wooden horse was all I could offer. Not money, not wisdom, just proof that even in a place without windows, something could still be shaped by hand. A shadow passed across the table. I flinched without meaning to, and when I looked up, it wasn't them. Just a man with a beard and a backpack, ordering something with too many words. I exhaled and tried to relax my shoulders, but they remained hunched, like they had learned a new language behind bars and didn't know how to unlearn it. The clock above the counter read 9:58. I had been there since 8:32. The numbers meant nothing, but still I watched them change, as if time would apologize if I paid it enough attention. My throat was dry. I hadn't spoken since I said thank you to the driver who dropped me off. The silence inside my skull felt padded, like a cell during lockdown. No sharp edges, no noise, just the hum of breath and the slow creep of thought. I had rehearsed nothing. What could I possibly say? I'm your father. I'm sorry. Words are too clean for things that broke in private. I didn't want to explain my absence with dates and details. I just wanted to look, to memorize, to hold something in my eyes that I couldn't touch. My hands kept returning to the wooden horse. I wiped an invisible smudge from its back, turned it again. Left. Right. Center. It looked anxious, waiting for feet that would never gallop. I understood that. There were dreams we carved just to survive, knowing they'd never move. Someone opened the door. A gust of autumn air brushed against my neck. It smelled of dry leaves and car exhaust, and something sharp I couldn't place, like new shoes or old memories. I didn't turn around. Not yet. I needed one more breath before the world shifted. The bell above the door jingled again. I heard light footsteps, smaller than adult shoes. 2 sets, then a third, heavier. My shoulders locked. My mouth went dry. I stared at the horse. The moment had arrived, and I was still sitting in silence, an old man in a borrowed coat, trying to steady his pulse with a carving of something that never lived. I had never been so close to everything I lost. And yet, it was still on the other side of the table. One moment, one breath, one heartbeat too wide to cross. I didn't look up at first. I heard the footsteps stop near the table, the shift of fabric as someone sat down across from me. One of the chairs scraped faintly against the floor. Then another. The third chair remained untouched for a moment, as if waiting for permission. I felt their presence before I dared to face it. The warmth of unfamiliar bodies, the air disturbed by motion too light to be adult. I smelled something sweet and innocent. Bubblegum, or maybe the faint vanilla of children's shampoo. It was jarring against the old leather and dust that still clung to my jacket. My fingers rested on the wooden horse as if it were an anchor. I traced the edge of its carved back again and again, my thumbnail catching on a groove I hadn't sanded perfectly. There had been no tools left near the end, only a shard of glass I had hidden inside a toothpaste cap. That groove remained as proof that something unfinished could still be offered. When I finally raised my head, I saw 2 small faces staring at me. The girl, older, maybe 9, had her mother's eyes, almond-shaped, dark around the lashes, with that same piercing stillness I had memorized from the photograph years ago. Her lips were pressed together, not cold, but cautious, like someone observing a fragile animal. Her brother, younger, maybe 6, sat with both hands cupped around a plastic cup of orange juice. His cheeks were full, flushed from the walk, and a streak of jelly shone near the corner of his mouth. He swung his legs beneath the table, just enough to make his sneakers knock gently against the metal leg. Their voices came slowly. Not at first. At first, there was only the sound of them breathing, of the straw in the juice cup making small gurgling sounds. Then the boy asked something to his sister. I couldn't catch it all, but it was about the wooden horse. She didn't answer him, just nudged the toy slightly forward, as if offering it without ceremony. I listened to their voices like a man listening to music through a thick wall, muffled, distant, but unmistakably beautiful. He spoke faster, words tumbling over themselves with that soft slur that comes when teeth are still figuring out their place. He asked questions, about me, I assumed, who I was, why I brought a toy instead of candy, what sailors eat on ships. He said something about anchors and storms and dolphins. I caught phrases like grandpa and map and big ocean. My heart ached at every word, not for what was said, but for how easily they spoke it without knowing who they were speaking to. The girl didn't say much. But when she did, her words were clear, deliberate. She corrected him once. Then she mentioned something about her school. Her voice had a rhythm to it, like she was used to being listened to, but not interrupted. There was a gravity in it. I realized she had already become her mother. I wanted to speak. I rehearsed lines in my head, phrases that felt simple, honest, safe. But nothing passed my lips. My tongue felt like a weight, thick and clumsy, and I was afraid of letting it slip. I didn't want to say anything that would break the fragile layer of trust that had somehow, miraculously, formed in the air between us. So, I listened. I listened to the way the boy mispronounced certain words, stretching syllables like they were made of taffy. I listened to the girl correct him gently, sometimes with a touch of humor that made his cheeks puff out with pride. I listened to them describe their dog, a golden retriever with a name that sounded like Milo, or maybe Marlowe. I heard about a Lego castle and a broken umbrella, and a science project involving beans in a paper cup. Every detail was gold to me. I folded each word carefully into the folds of my memory, as if tucking letters into a drawer that had long been empty. I hadn't heard children speak in decades, not directly to me, not in a way that expected a reply. It was like being allowed to touch water after a lifetime in a desert, knowing you couldn't drink but still soaking your hands in the miracle of it. Their mother sat at the edge of the table, one seat removed, silent. She watched, not with suspicion, but with a protective stillness I recognized. The way her hand occasionally moved toward the boy's juice cup, adjusting it slightly. The way her eyes followed every gesture. She wore a silver ring on her thumb, not a wedding band, but something thicker, maybe handmade. It caught the light when she turned her wrist. I focused on that ring when my eyes couldn't bear to rest on her face. The wooden horse changed hands several times during the meeting. The boy made it gallop across the table. Then he gave it wings, declaring it a flying horse. He tried to make it balance on one hoof, failed, and laughed so loudly that even the barista looked up. The girl took it next, studied it with her fingertips, and then, without a word, tucked it into the pocket of her coat. I felt something catch in my throat. Not pain, not joy, just a shift, like something long frozen inside me had cracked, and light slipped through. I remembered the exact motion of her fingers, the way she had folded the coat gently, respectfully, as if placing the toy in a place of honor. Outside the window, a bird landed on the metal railing. A pigeon, mottled gray with an iridescent throat. It bobbed once, pecked at a breadcrumb, and flew off again. The city moved past us in waves, mothers pushing strollers, men in suits clutching paper coffee cups, teenagers laughing too loud. But at our table, time felt paused, sacred, removed. Eventually, the boy leaned back and looked at me. His mouth opened, then closed again. Then he asked if I would be there next week. The question sliced me, not because it was cruel, but because it was innocent. I looked at his eyes, greenish-brown, wide open. I saw no suspicion in them, just a question asked with the full trust of someone who believed good things lasted. I didn't answer. His sister did. She said something vague, something soft. Her voice was calm, as if she'd known this moment would end before it began. Her hand brushed against his arm, steadying him, and he accepted it. Children are better than we are at adapting to boundaries they didn't ask for. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the only other thing I had brought, a folded napkin. On it, I had written a sentence the night before. My handwriting was uneven. I hadn't held a pen in years. The ink bled slightly from the pressure, but the words remained legible. It wasn't a message for them, just a name. My name. So that when they asked who made the horse, they would have something to hold on to. The girl took it, read it, said nothing. but she folded the napkin and placed it in her coat with the horse. The clock above the counter read 10:26. I would remember that time forever. The moment their voices faded, replaced by the hush of their exit, the scrape of chairs, the lingering scent of orange juice and cocoa powder, the absence of warmth across from me, the echo of possibility. I sat there long after they left, and though I had never been lonelier, I had never been more grateful for sound. The next morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise. I lay awake on the stiff couch of the rented room, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. They formed the rough shape of a map, perhaps of nothing real, but I traced its imagined coastlines with my eyes, as if plotting a route home. The springs under me creaked with every shift of weight, and the blanket smelled faintly of someone else's detergent, something floral and unfamiliar. On the floor beside me, wrapped in a soft cloth, rested the second toy. A small wooden whale I had carved years ago but never given away. Its body was smooth and rounded, sanded so many times that the grain of the wood had faded into something almost like skin. It fit neatly into my palm, its tail curled slightly as if mid-swim. I had etched tiny eyes on each side of its head, and though they were nothing more than pinpricks of ink, I always imagined they held depth. I had made the whale during my 3rd year inside, long before I knew I would ever see my daughter again, let alone meet her children. It was a shape I returned to often, not just because it was simple, but because it reminded me of the silence beneath the surface of things. Whales never felt violent to me. Even the idea of their size didn't frighten me. It comforted me. This notion of something massive and ancient moving quietly in the deep, unseen, but present. That was how I had wanted to live my years behind bars. Not to vanish, but to swim beneath the noise, unnoticed. I spent the better part of the morning polishing the toy with a handkerchief. I used the sleeve of my shirt to buff the curve of its back until it caught the light from the window. The glass of that window was dirty, streaked with fingerprints and fly spots, but the sunlight pushed through anyway, warm and golden. I held the whale up to it. It looked like something sacred. I didn't know if I would see them again. My daughter hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. The moment had ended without closure, which meant there was still space for something to happen. I wasn't naive. I didn't expect a second chance. I had no illusions of being welcomed into their home, of becoming part of holidays or bedtime stories. But I had carved this whale for a child's hand, and now that I had seen the small hands that might receive it, I couldn't pretend the shape had no meaning. I wrapped the whale again and placed it inside the inner pocket of my jacket, the one I rarely used. The zipper was stiff with age, but it still worked. I zipped it halfway, leaving just enough space for my fingers to reach in without looking. I wanted it close, as if the toy itself would tell me when the moment came. That day, I walked the length of the city. I passed playgrounds, coffee shops, a library where children's drawings were taped to the windows. I watched a woman tie her son's shoelaces outside a hardware store. I watched a boy cry because his balloon had floated into the branches of a tree. In another life, I might have been the one to buy the balloon, or tie the laces, or carry a paper cup of lemonade with 2 straws, one for me, one for a child leaning against my side. By noon, I found myself near the pier. The smell of salt hit me first, sharp and unmistakable. Then came the sounds, seagulls crying overhead, the slap of waves against the pylons, the creak of boats rocking gently in their moorings. I hadn't been near water in decades. I stood at the edge of the railing and closed my eyes. Somewhere far out, I imagined whales, the real ones, not shaped from cedar or pine, but vast, breathing creatures that moved with a patience no human could imitate. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled the toy out again. My hands were dry and lined, the skin around my knuckles cracked from the sudden change in weather. But the whale still fit in my grip. Its shape hadn't changed. only I had. I turned the whale over, studying the base. There was a word carved faintly there, a name I had once given it. Solace. I had forgotten that I named it. I couldn't remember why I chose the word at the time. Maybe it was a prayer, or maybe it was the only word I had that didn't sound like regret. By late afternoon, I sat on a bench not far from the elementary school. I didn't mean to go there. My legs carried me without instruction, like they knew where I needed to be. I sat beneath a jacaranda tree that had already begun to shed its blossoms. The purple petals covered the sidewalk like confetti after a parade. I watched as children were led outside in small groups, some waiting for parents, others chasing one another with wide, loose strides. The whale rested on my knee, hidden beneath a folded napkin. I wasn't going to approach them. I didn't even know if they would pass this way. I only needed to feel close, to exist in the same air. Around 4 o'clock, the shape of her appeared. My daughter. She stood with a straight back, her purse held tightly under one arm. The children were behind her, the girl walking ahead, the boy dragging his backpack like a tired animal. They didn't see me, and I didn't move. I watched them cross the street, wait for the signal, walk past the bus stop. The girl said something that made her mother smile faintly. The boy kicked a stone ahead of him, and then ran to catch up. My hand curled tightly around the whale. I felt its smooth surface dig into my palm. I didn't call out. I didn't wave. I only watched them until they were gone. That evening, I sat on the edge of the bed in the rented room. The lamp buzzed faintly. The whale sat on the nightstand, still wrapped in the napkin. I didn't unwrap it. I just let it sit there, like a question I was afraid to ask again. I dreamed of the ocean that night. Not the cold gray water of the pier, but something warmer, blue-green and vast. In the dream, I was underwater, floating without weight, and in the distance I saw the shadow of something enormous moving toward me. It wasn't threatening. It didn't speak. It only swam near, circled once, and disappeared into the light. When I woke, the whale was still there, waiting, quiet as ever, and I knew I wasn't finished. The morning I saw them again began with the ticking of the old travel clock I kept on the bedside table. It was a relic from the 70s, with faded green numbers and a loud, deliberate tick that sounded like a heartbeat in an otherwise quiet room. I had taken it with me when I left the halfway house. It wasn't worth anything, but I needed something to measure time that didn't glow or beep or pretend to understand my voice. Just a gear turning inside a square of plastic. Honest. Limited. Enough. The room was already warm. A faint whiff of coffee drifted through the cracked window from the diner across the street. I didn't have an appetite, but I liked the smell. It reminded me of break rooms and pay stubs, of the years before it all unraveled. My hands moved through the routine on their own. Wash, dress, check the clock, fold the jacket, smooth the collar, open the drawer, and retrieve the whale. I placed it in my pocket again, though I hadn't decided what to do with it. That morning, I had received a message. Just a short note, folded and pushed under the door of the rooming house. No envelope, no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. My daughter's. The loop in the Y was still sharp at the tail, just like it had been in high school when she used to scribble her name in the corners of library books. The note read, "If you want to try again, be here at 3, 5 minutes." That was all. I spent the next 5 hours walking, not because the meeting place was far. It wasn't, but because my legs couldn't stay still. I wandered through alleys and back streets, through parks and beneath billboards advertising things I no longer understood. I watched a young couple kiss behind a delivery truck. I saw an old man feeding pigeons with practiced movements. I passed a laundromat where machines hummed and turned behind foggy glass, and I stood there for a while, just watching the cycles spin like years collapsing into foam. At one point, I found myself in front of a toy store. The window was filled with color, reds, blues, yellows, but nothing drew me. Plastic shapes, battery-powered chaos. Nothing held still long enough to feel real. I looked down at the small bulge in my pocket where the wooden whale rested and felt an ache deep in my chest. Not pain, not regret. Something older than both. By the time I reached the park, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm, slanting light across the grass. The benches were half full. Parents, retirees, teenagers tapping their phones. The fountain still worked, though the water sputtered every few seconds as if tired. I found the bench nearest to the oak tree, the one with initials carved into its bark so deep the wood had begun to heal around them. I sat with the whale in my palm, concealed by the fold of my coat, and watched the minute hand crawl forward on the watch strapped to my wrist. The watch was a prison issue, cheap, digital, utilitarian, but I wore it anyway. I liked the simplicity of the numbers, the lack of pretense. It had no alarms, no features, only a screen that showed what I needed. The now. I checked it again. 2:58. I tried not to count the seconds, but my thumb pressed automatically on the plastic side, triggering the dim green light. Time wasn't slowing down. It never did. It only got quieter. At exactly 3, I saw them. She walked a few paces ahead of them, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted the way I remembered from the dance recitals and science fairs long ago. She hadn't aged poorly, but the years had drawn deeper lines beneath her eyes and made her movements more deliberate. Behind her, the 2 children walked side by side, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8. They each held a juice box, their straws barely moving. Their clothes were bright, their shoes clean. They had no idea who I was. I didn't stand. I didn't want to startle them. I didn't want to break the shape of the moment. My daughter saw me and gave the faintest nod. That was it. Permission. The children approached slowly, cautious but curious. The girl looked at the bench, then at the tree, then at me. The boy glanced at the whale in my hand, which I had now turned face up, letting it rest gently in the open curve of my fingers. I offered it without words. The boy stepped forward first, hesitantly, as if testing the air. His fingers closed around the wooden shape. He turned it over in his hands, studying its weight. Then the girl came closer. She reached out and traced the tail with one fingertip. I watched their faces. I watched the curiosity bloom into something softer. Not joy, not quite, but interest. Recognition, maybe. That this wasn't something bought, that it was made, that it carried something quiet. I wanted to memorize every detail. The pattern of freckles on the boy's nose, the way the girl tucked her hair behind her ear before leaning in, the sound of their breaths, unfiltered by fear, the simple way they stood there, together, between shadows and sun. I glanced at the watch. 3 minutes had passed. The boy looked up at me and smiled. Just a small one, crooked and uncertain. The kind of smile that lives in the corner of the mouth before it travels to the eyes. I felt something shift inside me, a warmth I hadn't expected. The girl tilted her head and whispered something to her brother. He nodded. Then, together, they turned and walked back toward their mother. She was waiting, hands folded, expression unreadable. The boy stopped once more, looked back at me, and lifted the whale into the air for just a second. A gesture I didn't understand at first. Then I realized he was showing it to me again, as if to say, "I'll remember this. I'll remember this shape." Then they left. The sound of their footsteps faded into the noise of the park, the rustling of leaves, the fountain sputtering, a distant horn. I sat still for a long time. I didn't check the time again. The clock would only tell me what I already knew. 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, I had seen the shape of life as it might have been, as it might still become, if the world tilted just slightly. The bench grew cold beneath me. The shadows lengthened. But I didn't move. Not yet. I wanted to sit with the silence they left behind, the one that didn't hurt, the one that sounded almost like peace. After they left, I remained on the bench long after the sun dipped below the line of trees. I sat still as the park emptied out, as voices faded into the soft hush of tires on damp streets, as the street lamps flickered to life in sequence like old memories. The wood beneath me creaked each time I shifted, but I didn't get up. My hand, without realizing it, kept reaching into the same pocket, expecting to find the weight that had been there for months, the little whale. But now the pocket was empty, hollow. I let my fingers rest inside anyway, cupped loosely against the lining. It was threadbare, smooth from wear. The fabric had grown thin over the years, and in the silence, I imagined I could feel the ghost of the whale's shape, like a warmth that had lingered too long and vanished too fast. A breeze moved across the park, gentle and indifferent. It brought with it the scent of damp grass and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood or time itself. I closed my eyes for a moment and inhaled. I had forgotten how sharp the air could be in the evenings, how it wrapped around the ribs and stayed there. In prison, the air had no stories. It was filtered, recycled, scrubbed clean of all memory. But this was alive, even if it hurt. Eventually I stood. The movement was slow, careful. My knees cracked like old floorboards, and my spine ached in that familiar way. Not from labor, but from years of keeping still. I checked my watch. It was nearly 6. 3 hours had passed since they left, and I hadn't spoken a single word. I wasn't sure I could have. I began walking without a clear direction, only that I couldn't sit anymore. The streets were soft now, blurred by the haze of twilight. Storefronts had begun closing their blinds. A neon sign buzzed above a liquor store, throwing pink and red flickers onto the sidewalk. I passed a barber shop, its chairs empty and mirrors reflecting nothing but fluorescent ghosts. At the corner, I stopped at a vending machine. It stood alone, humming faintly, its light a small square of false promise. I pressed my hand against the glass and looked at the rows of packaged candy, chips, and soda bottles lined up like a last resort. I had no coins. I reached into my pocket again, the same one, forgetting for a second that I had already given everything I had worth offering. The whale was gone. I had nothing to trade. And still I reached. It was a habit I hadn't broken. In prison, you learn to check your pockets often, not for anything of value, but just to confirm what little you still owned. A folded letter, a piece of string, a button, anything to remind you that you existed in more than just theory. I looked at my reflection in the vending machine glass. The fluorescent glare flattened my face, made the lines deeper, my eyes more sunken. I barely recognized the man staring back. He didn't look like a grandfather. He looked like someone passing through, unnoticed, unrooted. I turned and walked again, this time toward the train station. Not to leave. I had nowhere else to go. But because I liked the sound of trains coming and going. I liked the way they arrived and departed without explanation, without fanfare. They didn't ask for permission. They just moved. I envied that. At the station, I found a bench near the platform. It was cold, made of metal slats, but I didn't mind. A man in a business suit sat 3 benches down, scrolling through his phone, his bag neatly zipped at his feet. A few teenagers loitered near the far end, laughing too loud, pretending not to care about anything. A woman in scrubs leaned against a column, her shoulders sagging, a coffee cup shaking slightly in her hands. I sat with them, not close enough to be noticed, just close enough to feel human. The loudspeaker cracked, announcing a train to somewhere I had never been. The sound echoed, sharp and detached. The train arrived, hissed, opened its doors. No one got on. No one left. The doors shut. The train pulled away. I watched it disappear, feeling a strange kinship with its departure. When I stood again, my hand went instinctively to my pocket. Empty. Always empty now. I walked back to the rooming house slowly. Night had fallen completely. Streetlights buzzed above. A cat darted across an alley. Somewhere a television blared through a half-open window, laughter from a sitcom filling the air like a language I had forgotten. In my room, I turned on the single overhead bulb. It flickered once, then held. The mattress was still unmade. The chair by the window had gathered dust. I removed my coat and laid it carefully across the bed. Then I sat, pulled off my shoes, and placed them side by side beneath the chair. A small ritual, a habit, order in a world where little else could be controlled. I took the travel clock from the nightstand and wound it. The tick returned, slow and measured, like the breath of something old and deliberate. I placed it back. Its presence comforted me more than I liked to admit. Before sleep, I opened the drawer where I used to keep the whale. Empty. I closed it gently. Then I sat for a long time in the half-light, listening to the ticking of the clock and the distant traffic, hand resting in a pocket that no longer held anything, and yet somehow held everything that mattered. Because even an empty pocket can remember. I woke to the sound of rain tapping the window pane, like fingers drumming an anxious rhythm. It was the soft kind, the kind that blankets a town without making a show of it, the kind of rain that made memories rise like steam from sidewalks. I stayed in bed longer than usual, eyes fixed on the pale ceiling, stained faintly yellow near the corner, where old leaks had bled through plaster long ago. The stain looked like a map, and I used to trace imaginary routes through it during sleepless nights. I reached toward the nightstand and took the clock in my hand. Its ticking had become a metronome for my thoughts, its face scratched, the brass rim dulled by time and thumb oil. I wound it slowly, listening as the coil tightened. Tick, tick. It kept me anchored. A man needs something to set his rhythm by, even if it's just a wind-up relic from another century. The room smelled of something old, wood warmed by heat rising from the radiator, laundry soap from the shirts I'd hand-washed in the sink the day before, and faintly, always, the musty echo of lives lived in rooms like this before mine. There was a cigarette burn on the dresser. Someone else's ghost. I boiled water in the kettle on the hot plate. It hissed and rattled as if reluctant to work. I poured it over instant coffee in a chipped mug with the faded words, "Best grandpa ever." A thrift store find, ironic and cruel. I drank it slowly, not because it was good, but because it filled the silence and gave my hand something to do. There was no mail that morning. I checked the rusted box in the hallway out of habit. It squealed when I opened it, the sound too loud in the stillness. Empty. No letter. No note. No sign. I had told myself I wasn't expecting anything, but still I looked. Still I hoped. Back in my room, I pulled the drawer open and stared at the blank sheet of paper I had laid there the night before. I had intended to write, to leave something behind, a letter, a thought, anything. But I couldn't start, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I feared saying everything. The pen lay across the page, like a needle across a patient who never woke up. I sat at the desk, the chair groaning under me, and stared through the window. The world outside was gray and blurred with rain. Across the street, a woman walked her dog under a broken umbrella. Cars rolled by with wet sighs. Life moved in loops while I stayed here. I used to think that if I ever had the chance, I'd write her a letter. My daughter. Not to justify or explain, but simply to tell her who I had become in the silence. The books I'd read, the apologies I rehearsed, the carvings, the way my hands had changed, how I no longer rushed my meals, how I had stopped flinching at keys turning in locks, how I counted days, not in anger, but in dust motes and bird shadows. But I couldn't start the letter. Not that day. Not yet. Instead, I walked. I put on my coat, heavy and damp at the cuffs, and slipped into the rhythm of the town. The streets were familiar in their unfamiliarity. Everything was new, and yet my feet seemed to know the cracks in the sidewalk, the tilt of the curb, the way the street lamp leaned slightly on 7th Avenue, like an old man with back pain. I walked until I found myself near the library. It was an old building, red brick, moss creeping up its base like ivy, without ambition. The door creaked as I entered, and the warmth inside fogged my glasses. The smell hit me hard. Old paper, wood polish, dust. I had once dreamed of being a librarian. Before the steel bars and numbers and hours marked by light changes on concrete. I browsed aimlessly, touched spines, read blurbs I wouldn't remember. I found the children's section, tucked in a corner with low shelves and beanbags, and I stood there too long. A boy sat cross-legged, reading about dinosaurs, and I turned away before he could look up and wonder why an old man in a prison coat stood staring at picture books. I signed out a single novel, something I had read in my 20s. The librarian didn't ask for ID. Maybe she saw something in my face, or maybe I'd become invisible again. Back at the room, I placed the book on the nightstand and sat on the bed. The paper was still there, still blank. The pen hadn't moved. I made soup from a can and ate it with crackers that had gone soft. I watched the rain continue through the warped glass. I held the pen, then set it down, then picked it up again. I wrote the date. I stared at it for an hour. Then I crumpled the page and tossed it into the trash. It landed among empty tea packets and a worn bus schedule. I lit a candle, not for drama, but because the power flickered twice, and watched its flame reflect in the window. I told myself I'd try again tomorrow. Maybe then the letter would come. Or maybe some truths were meant to stay inside the body, like breath you hold when passing a graveyard. That night I wound the clock again. It didn't protest. It never did. It ticked faithfully into the dark, steady and soft, as if time had already forgiven me, even if no one else had. The wooden box had been in my possession for so long that my hands knew its every imperfection better than they knew themselves. I had built it with scraps of oak salvaged from the prison workshop, sanding the corners smooth with a piece of torn denim, and a patience born of long silences. The latch was a bent nail I'd filed down with a piece of concrete. The lid creaked like a tired breath every time I opened it, a sound that felt more familiar than my own voice. I had carried that box with me like a secret heartbeat, and now it sat in front of me on the rickety table of a borrowed motel room, waiting to be opened one last time. The room smelled of old cigarettes and citrus disinfectant, an odd mixture that clung to the yellowed curtains, like guilt. The air conditioner sputtered every few minutes and coughed out cold air that never quite reached the corners of the room. I sat on the bed with my knees bent, the box on the table, and the silence thick around me. I could hear the faint ticking of the motel's lobby clock through the paper-thin walls, the same rhythmic tick I had listened to in the prison mess hall for over 3 decades. That kind of sound sinks into you, makes your bones keep time long after the noise has gone. I opened the box slowly, the lid groaning like it remembered every year it had held its breath. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of a gray prison-issue t-shirt, was the little wooden whale. I had carved it during the long winter after my second parole denial. Using nothing but a spoon and a stolen razor blade, I kept hidden behind the sink. It had started as a lump of frustration, a useless chunk of wood I meant to burn in the workshop stove. But I kept turning it over in my hands. And one night, I saw the curve of a tail, the rise of a back, and I began to shape something more than myself. The whale was small enough to fit in a child's palm, its body smoothed to a dull sheen by hours of rubbing with worn cloth. I had carved a smile into its face, not the kind you see in photographs, but the quiet curve of something that has seen the deep and surfaced anyway. Its eyes were shallow indents, simple hollows filled with graphite from a pencil I had broken in two. It had no name, no story, not yet. I had waited to give those to it until I knew who would hold it. Beside the whale lay a folded paper, yellowed at the edges. It was the only letter I had written in prison that I never sent. It began with "To whoever you grow to be," and ended with "I made this for your hand, not mine." I had read it too many times, the words fading from meaning into something like breathing, necessary, automatic, painful when interrupted. I didn't plan on giving the letter, not now. The whale was enough, or maybe it wasn't. I didn't know anymore. I picked it up and weighed it in my palm. It was heavier than it looked, not in mass, but in memory. The grain of the oak still showed through the soft polish, like a topographical map of all the years I had lost. The tail had a small chip in it, from the time a guard kicked my locker open during a surprise cell search, and it had fallen to the floor. I hadn't fixed it. That chip was part of the story now. I placed it back in the cloth, folded it gently, and closed the box. The latch clicked into place, a final punctuation mark. My bag, a cheap canvas duffel from a church donation box, lay on the floor by the bed. I tucked the wooden box inside, between a spare pair of socks and an old photograph of myself and my daughter when she was 4. She had been wearing a pink raincoat and holding a maple leaf the size of her head. I didn't remember taking the picture, but I remembered the smell of wet leaves and the way she had laughed when it stuck to her boot. Outside, the sky was slipping into a dull lavender, the kind of sky that made you feel like the world was starting over somewhere you couldn't reach. I stood up and stretched, my back cracking like old furniture. The air outside would be cooler now, full of car exhaust and distant barbecue smoke. People lived their lives out there. People who had never worn numbers on their backs or counted holidays by the meals they were served. I wasn't one of them. Not anymore. Maybe never again. I picked up the bag and slung it over my shoulder, the weight of the box pressed against my side, a quiet reminder. I didn't know how the meeting would go. I didn't know if the kids would even want to hold the whale, or if they'd set it aside like a forgotten souvenir from a place they didn't remember visiting. But I had made something with my hands. I had shaped something small and honest. And that had to be enough. In the hallway, the buzzing light flickered as I passed, and I caught my reflection in a dented metal fire extinguisher. My face looked older than I felt, and more tired than I admitted, but my eyes were clear. That had to count for something. As I stepped out into the parking lot, gravel crunching under my boots, I looked up at the motel sign. Cedar Pines, weekly rates. A blinking "no" sat awkwardly beside a barely lit vacancy. The letters reminded me of the prison sign-in board. Same red glow, same unspoken warning. I walked toward the bus stop with the box in my bag and a map in my coat pocket, a torn corner marked with her address. My daughter's house. The whale would travel the last stretch with me, its smile hidden in a bundle of cloth, its weight steady, its silence louder than any word I had rehearsed. It was a gift, yes, but also an apology carved with calluses, smoothed with hope. A small piece of me that might survive, even if I didn't. The motel mirror was chipped on the left edge, just enough to distort my reflection like a ripple in a pond. I'd spent the morning staring at it, brushing the sleeves of my only clean shirt with a damp towel. The collar was soft from age and prison starch, and it no longer sat right. Still, it smelled faintly of pine soap and dust. My new signature, I supposed. I had laid the wooden box open on the table the night before and stared at it long after the TV's static ended. That morning, I didn't wear my watch. The one I'd worn for 20 years inside, ticking soft against my wrist like a quiet second heart, now sat in the wooden box beside the whale. I didn't want to measure time anymore. Not today. I had asked her to meet me somewhere neutral. A diner would have been too much, too public. The sidewalk outside a library seemed appropriate. Ordinary, forgettable. The kind of place where no one asked who you were. I arrived early. Too early. The city was still chewing its breakfast. Delivery trucks backing into alleyways, pigeons fighting over scraps of muffin outside a coffee shop. I sat on the low stone bench beside a tree that had grown into the iron grate around its trunk, twisting out like a memory trying to escape. A little boy passed by with his mother, dragging a toy airplane by a string. It bounced behind him, wheels rattling on the sidewalk. That sound pierced something in me. It reminded me of the noise my grandson's wooden whale made when he'd rolled it across the floor that day. A soft click and drag, the sound of being noticed, then forgotten. She came from the west, walking against the light wind, her coat too thin for the weather, just like mine. Her hair was tied back in a way I didn't remember, and her sunglasses were too large for her face. A mother's armor. Her expression didn't change when she saw me. She stopped a few feet away and crossed her arms. I stood, holding the box in both hands like it might fall apart. I nodded. She didn't. She glanced toward the library, then back at me. Her mouth was drawn tight. I could feel the tremble in her shoulders, though her feet remained still. There was no hug, no handshake, just a silence that stretched out between us like a cracked sidewalk. I held out the box, not toward her, but between us, a truce offering. She looked at it, then past it, like it carried too much weight for her arms. I cleared my throat, not to speak, just to steady myself. She asked if I'd told them the truth. I shook my head. She didn't smile, but I thought I saw her shoulders drop slightly, as if I'd passed some unspoken test. She told me, firmly, that this could not become a habit, that they didn't need confusion, not at this age, that she had built a life out of pieces I had broken. I nodded again. Her voice was cold, but not cruel, more like a teacher reciting rules at the beginning of class, rules no one had the right to change. I wanted to tell her something, anything, but the words jammed in my throat, like wet newspaper. What could I say? That I still remembered her second-grade handwriting? That I had carved that whale during a stormy week when I thought I'd never see her again? That I watched her son lift it and laugh, and that laugh still echoed in my ribs every night since? But none of that came out. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. My name wasn't written on it. There was no name at all. She placed it beside me on the bench. A goodbye, in paper form. I didn't open it. I didn't even touch it. Not then. As she turned to leave, a gust of wind caught her scarf and flung it lightly across my sleeve. I watched her walk away until her figure blurred into the morning bustle. A man passed me, looked at the envelope, and asked if I was saving the seat. I shook my head, stood, and left the envelope where it lay. Back in the motel room, the shadows on the wall stretched like fingers toward the floor. I sat in the chair by the window and held the box again. The whale had a tiny chip on its tail now, probably from a fall I didn't see. I ran my thumb over it. On the inside of the lid, I had carved a name, his name, and beneath it, I had added one more word that morning. Grandpa. Not mine to claim, but I left it there anyway. Someone else's name, maybe, but my truth, and that would have to be enough. The afternoon light in that part of the neighborhood always fell sideways, filtered through crooked tree limbs and sagging power lines. It gave everything a grainy texture, as if the day were printed on rough newsprint. I walked slowly, past the same mailbox I'd passed 3 times before, past the same low picket fence with its missing slat, past the smell of hot concrete and magnolia leaves. I was circling a block I could not enter. I had found his school. It was a square red brick building with a narrow yard, fenced in not with bars, but with cheerful chain link painted blue. There were dinosaur cutouts zip-tied to the metal. Their colors were faded, the eyes peeling, but they smiled nonetheless. I stood across the street for nearly 40 minutes, pretending to wait for someone, shifting my weight between the toes and heels of my shoes like I'd learned to do in line at Chow. I leaned against a tree, then walked a few steps, then returned to the same square of sidewalk. I never crossed over. It wasn't that I feared being recognized. No one knew me. That was the problem. No one could have picked me out from the lineup of forgotten men in borrowed jackets and faces worn thin by silence. I wasn't watching for anyone to notice me. I was watching to remember him. At 3:05 p.m., the first bell rang. The sound was delicate, not shrill like the bells I remembered. A soft chime, followed by the thunder of sneakers. Kids burst from the doors like popcorn from an open pot, all limbs and backpacks, untucked shirts and half-zipped jackets. Some sprinted, some dragged, some cried, some didn't notice the sky. I watched each of them. I didn't know what he looked like anymore. I had seen the photo on his mother's desk, the only one, and he'd been no more than a toddler. His hair was a reddish gold, soft curls on the edges. But that was 5 years ago. Faces change like tides. I had no map to follow, only instinct. And instinct, after all this time, was just guesswork with scars. A boy passed by holding a shadow in his hand. At first I didn't understand what I was seeing. He was gripping a wire ring on a stick, maybe from a science project, and the way it moved in the sunlight, it cast a perfect circle of darkness on the sidewalk, just ahead of him, like a leash on something invisible. He walked slowly, carefully, adjusting his hand so that the shadow wouldn't break. I watched as he followed it, step by step, never looking at me, but entirely focused on keeping that circle whole. The sight of it undid me. It reminded me of something I used to do in the prison yard. I would walk the full perimeter of the yard at dawn, when the light was softest, and watch how my own shadow shifted with the rising sun. When it was long, I felt tall again. When it was gone, I remembered who I was. Shadow was the only honest mirror I had. The boy, my grandson maybe, paused beside the fence and looked up at the tree across the street. I froze. His eyes squinted, not from suspicion, but from sun. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But he looked. Through me, perhaps. Or past me. I couldn't tell. Then he was gone, running toward a woman in a red coat who bent to hug him, lifting him off the ground. Her laughter was bright and raw, and he melted into her like sugar in tea. It wasn't his mother. I didn't know who she was. A neighbor? A friend? A caretaker? Maybe even his teacher. It didn't matter. He was held, and I was not meant to cross that space between the curb and his small running feet. I stood there for another 10 minutes after the last child had left. The street was empty, the wind had picked up, and my breath had turned cool in my chest. The wire circle, now discarded on the grass, spun once, caught in a breeze, then fell flat. I didn't move to pick it up. I left it there, the way I had left so many other things, quietly, without farewell. Back at the motel, the shadows on the wall were longer than usual. I boiled water on the little stove and poured it over a tea bag I'd used twice before. The smell of weak lemon and something metallic filled the room. I opened the drawer beside the bed and pulled out the spiral notebook. The pages were thin, nearly translucent, but they held the only map I trusted, Scribbled dates, partial names, directions written by hand as if memory itself needed anchoring in ink. I added one more line beneath all the others. Watch the boy follow a shadow. He didn't break it. I closed the notebook. Outside, the neon sign of the liquor store buzzed like a dying insect. I turned off the light, pulled the covers over me, and let the dark stretch across the room. I stared at the ceiling until I couldn't tell if the shapes I saw were real or memories. In that hour before sleep, everything looked like a shadow trying to find its source. I walked slowly that morning. The world felt distant, wrapped in a soft mist that dulled the outlines of trees, houses, even my own thoughts. The sidewalk was damp from the night's rain, and each step pressed the soles of my shoes into tiny dark prints, as if marking time I had no right to reclaim. I didn't carry anything except the wooden box. It was light, worn smooth by the years, and my hands, with its tiny brass latch clicking gently with every sway of my arm. Inside, the carved whale slept in its bed of soft cloth, and somehow I felt more like its guardian than its maker. The streets were empty. The wind smelled of old leaves and something faintly sweet, like the beginning of spring, though it was months away. My coat hung loose on my shoulders, the same one I had worn when I stepped out of the gates. Patches on the elbows, a button missing near the collar, the lining torn where the pocket used to be. I had mended the hem with mismatched thread in a shelter bathroom mirror, with a needle someone had lent me without asking questions. That morning, the thread shone faintly in the light, like a scar that didn't hurt anymore. I passed the park where I had once sat and watched two boys chase a red ball until it rolled beneath my bench. I never knew if they were hers. I never asked. I had simply watched the small feet thunder past, the breathless giggle of children too full of life to notice the silence of old men. The bench was wet now, empty. Even the pigeons were elsewhere. I reached the corner just before their house and stopped, not out of hesitation but out of ritual. I checked my watch, though I knew it was wrong. It had always run 2 minutes slow since the glass cracked in the prison workshop. I kept it that way. It gave me a sense of being behind time, and I liked the honesty of it. The face was yellowed, the hands scratched, but it ticked steadily. A reminder that even broken things could still keep moving. Their street smelled different, like laundry and wet soil. The hum of a distant lawnmower droned faintly beneath the chirp of birds. A flag moved slowly on a porch 2 houses down, its faded red and white stripes curling at the edges. The house itself looked smaller than I remembered, though I had never truly seen it. Just photographs once, blurred and folded, smuggled through letters I wasn't supposed to receive. I didn't knock. She said not to. She said to leave it near the flower pots and walk away. The pots were still there, chipped and filled with dead stems. One had a cracked rim and a tiny plastic dinosaur half buried in the soil, its head poking out as if surveying its kingdom. I wondered if he had placed it there. One of them. Maybe during some grand expedition in their backyard jungle. I set the box gently beside the dinosaur. I stood for a moment, watching the curtains flutter slightly. Somewhere inside, they were having cereal. Laughing, maybe. Fighting over toys or morning cartoons. I imagined the smell of milk and toast and the buzz of a refrigerator. She was there too, no doubt in the kitchen, maybe glancing out the window. She wouldn't come out. She had already said goodbye in her own way. Her voice still echoed in my mind, calm and tired. I didn't blame her. I didn't expect more. I touched the latch of the box once before stepping back. The wood still held the scent of linseed oil and thyme. I remembered the cell, the rhythm of carving each curve, the silence of those hours, the way the shape slowly emerged from nothing. A whale. Heavier at the front, with eyes that weren't really eyes, just hollows where the blade had hesitated. The tail curled slightly, unfinished. I had left it that way on purpose. Not every story needs a perfect end. I turned and walked back the way I came. The sidewalk was drying now, and my footprints from earlier were already fading. The clouds had thinned, and the sky above the rooftops was starting to clear. I passed the bench again. Still empty. Still waiting. A single feather lay across one of the slats, caught on a splinter like a thought not yet let go. When I reached the bus stop, I sat on the edge of the bench and looked at my watch. Still 2 minutes slow. A car passed by, music spilling faintly through the window. Something cheerful, something I didn't recognize. I let the sound drift through me without holding on to it. In my pocket, I felt the tiny slip of paper she had given me weeks before. No words, just an address. And in my chest, a hollow where once a man had lived who thought he would come back to something. What I found instead was a moment. One moment. 5 minutes in the presence of something fragile and unknowable. The soft edge of a child's voice calling for cereal. The glimpse of a shadow behind the curtain. The weight of a carved whale in a stranger's hand. I didn't need more. Not really. The bus arrived with a soft hiss, and I stepped aboard without looking back. I kept my head low and took the seat near the back, where I could press my forehead against the cool glass and watch the houses blur past like old dreams. The road stretched ahead, cracked and silver with sun. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had left something behind that might last longer than memory, and that, somehow, was enough.